Hello once again. There is a song by the rock group REM entitled Losing My Religion. And I thought, well, that'll be an appropriate lesson title for today. But then I found that losing my religion isn't talking about religious faith. Apparently it's a phrase from the American South which has to do with being at your wit's end, being in a state of stress because you've run out of patience or you've run out of mental strength. However, the fact remains that people do lose their religion in terms of religious faith, and I've seen that happen many times. For instance, in Psalm 73, you have somebody there who is virtually at that point. They looked at the prosperity of the wicked and compared that with their own struggling situation, and they came very close to giving up their belief. How about you? Do you ever feel like that? Perhaps you feel like that now. I know that I've gone through that a number of times during my life as a Christian. And so the question arises, what can we do about it? Because I've seen some Christians who had very strong faith, very active in the church, who ended up walking away from it all. What can we do to deal with that situation in our own lives? Well, if you go through the Bible, there's various reasons why people lose their faith. For example, it might be the influence of an unbelieving spouse, wife or husband, and Solomon found himself in that situation. Or, as we mentioned in Psalm 73, it may be a matter of comparison. You look at your own struggling state as a Christian, you look at others who are not Christians and everything seems to be going well for them, so you think, well, what's the point of being a Christian? It may be the cares of everyday life. It may be the striving for wealth. It may be false teachers. It may be the focus upon the opportunities and the pleasures of this life. It might be upon sin itself, that you simply engaging in behavior which you know it's wrong, but it's very pleasurable. The Bible talks about the pleasures of sin. So these can cause us to quit the faith. And there are other reasons as well. It might be depression. That might be a temporary thing, that you're depressed over something specific, or it may be an ongoing psychological problem, that you're just constantly feeling depressed about life in general. It may be frustration. It may be frustration with your own ongoing spiritual battles. Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 7, where he speaks about how he'd battled to follow God's teachings and avoid certain behaviors, and yet he found himself struggling to do so. It may be frustration with a lack of progress, and preachers can go through that. You work hard for years and years and years and don't seem to be getting anywhere with it. And that might lead you to think of giving up. There may be discouragement even due to problems within your congregation. There may be antagonism, there may be apathy, there may be gossip. And I've seen people give up because of what was going on in their own particular church. Personal tragedy, the death of a loved one, and people sometimes lose faith because of that. It may be pride. Perhaps you find yourself successful in certain enterprise, people are praising you all the time, and so you begin to think, well, you know, I'm pretty good. And therefore there's this idea, I don't really need God. It may be intellectual problems, and these particularly have bothered me at times. For instance, how do you reconcile the idea of a loving, powerful God with all the evil and the suffering that exists in the world? Or how do you deal with evolution and all the related teachings of science in comparison with the idea of creation in the Bible? and there may be other questions as well that have come up in your own mind. And on top of that, there is also the interconnectedness of human nature. A preacher named Dale Hartman, I remember talking about this. He made the point that we as humans have a spiritual, an emotional, a mental, a physical side to ourselves. And it may well be that an ongoing physical problem drains us mentally and emotionally, and thus can drain us spiritually as well. It's not that there's a spiritual cause for our problem, but one aspect of our life affects another aspect of our life. And so the list goes on. You may have additional experiences from your own life as to things that ate away at your faith, or maybe eating away at it right now. So the question is, when we find ourselves in that situation, what can we do about it? Now, I could take each of these causes that I've mentioned and analyze them, looking for how we deal with each specific instance, but that would take far too long. So I've thought of 4 general areas this morning that I've found helpful, and maybe you will find them helpful as well. The first one is, in the long run, take every opportunity to strengthen your faith, because there are things which will strengthen your faith. For example, I can go over to Romans, the 10th chapter and verse 17, and the statement there is, faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. So the word can strengthen our faith. Now, I realise that's being talked about there in an evangelistic sense, but nevertheless there are other passages such as John 20 verses 30 and 31 which talk about how the scriptures contain material which can strengthen us and help us. For instance, I just go over a few pages to Romans chapter 15 and verse 4. For whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, that through endurance and through the encouragement of the scriptures we may have hope. So there's encouragement there in the Old Testament as well as in the New Testament. So that's a source of strength. There's also something else mentioned over in Hebrews, the 10th chapter, verses 24 and 25. And this can be a source of help that gets neglected. Hebrews 10 verse 24, and let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. So there's encouragement, there's strengthening in being with other Christians. And I've been very fortunate down through the years to have a network of people there that I've been able to get advice from and get encouragement from and talk to. And that can be a source of help for us as well. Some of you will know a member of the church named Janie Penhall. And Janie has said to me some years back that I should consider myself fortunate for having come into the church at the time and place that I did. I became a member of the church way back in the late 60s at a congregation in North Ryde, the Macquarie congregation in Sydney. And I was very fortunate that that time there was a breadth and depth of teaching and encouragement which laid a strong foundation in me. And it didn't prevent me from going through various struggles and making various mistakes over the years. But what it provided there was a foundation of belief in God, that despite all my struggles and my failures at times, I could never let go of that belief. It remained firm. So, you know, we benefit, we are strengthened by various avenues, and we need to make use of those avenues in the good times that'll help us then to handle the difficult times. And there's things like developing a strong prayer life, developing a regular, ongoing, thoughtful process of Bible reading and Bible study. Many have been making the point for a long time that we're now facing a case of Bible illiteracy in the church, where Christians are not seriously engaging in Bible reading and Bible study. Well, we're missing out on a source of strength there. Participation in all the activities of the church, the worship, the preaching, the Bible classes, the fellowship activities, and also close involvement, ongoing involvement, regular involvement with other Christians who, as I said, can encourage us and help us. Come over with me to Matthew 13. Jesus here is preaching a parable, and it deals with a point that I'm making here. In Matthew 13, you've got the parable of the sower. The old way of farming, where you'd have seed in a pouch and you'd scatter the seed by hand, and the seed sometimes would fall on different surfaces, and some of this seed falls on rocky ground. Matthew 13 and verse 5, other seeds fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. There was no depth to them. I remember at one house we lived in, we had a small pomegranate, and that thing never grew over the years. It just stayed the same stunted height, and eventually it died. And as I dug it out, I dug down to see what the problem was, and sure enough, right below it there was this big sandstone rock that had stunted its development. Jesus gives the explanation in Matthew chapter 13 and verse 20. As for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, yet he has no root in himself, but endures for a while, and when tribulation or persecution arises on account of the word, immediately he falls away, because there's no depth there. So what we really need to do is to build up a depth of faith which will stick with us when the going gets tough. So in the good times, use that to strengthen you for the difficult times. And if you are starting to struggle with your faith, then look for ways that you can be strengthened and helped. A second point is, if the problem is intellectual, seek answers. There's a promise that Jesus made over in Matthew chapter 7, verses 7 and 8. Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and the one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks it will be opened. And what that says to me is there are answers if we're willing to look for them and to persevere in looking for them. I've told the story many times of when I first began working as a preacher in Tasmania, and people kept asking me, if there's a good God, why is there so much evil in the world, and why is there so much suffering in the world? And I found after a while my answers to that were not adequate, and that really bothered me. And what did I do? I sat down for an hour a day and I began studying anything and everything that was relevant to the issue. And I studied my way right through the Bible, looking at material that dealt with this issue of evil and suffering. And I read every other book that I could lay my hands on. And you say, well, how long did that take you? It took me quite a while. But it wasn't that long before I started seeing the answers. And taking that time really helped build my faith and gave me material which has stuck with me for more than 40 years since that time. Let me give you another example here. A few weeks ago I heard this said, that the biology of the neck of a giraffe disproves the existence of an intelligent God. Now, in actual fact, there's various things about the neck of a giraffe which point to God. But the point that was being made here related to something called the laryngeal nerve. And in the neck of a giraffe, it travels all the way down the neck and then all the way back up the neck. A total of 15 feet, almost 4.6 meters. And the point was made, it could have gone directly and taken a much shorter route. And so that proves that, if there was a God, God didn't know what he was doing. And really, they say it disproves God. Now, you might hear things like that and not give it any thought, but when I hear statements like that, it locks into my brain. And rather than letting it eat away, niggle away, I went and looked for some answers. Now, I'm not saying I've looked at it entirely in depth, and I do plan to look at it more. But nevertheless, it was interesting just in the looking that I did do. I came across an evolutionist who said, look, this sort of argument doesn't prove anything either way. He said, if there is an intelligent designer, you don't know what was in the mind of the designer as to why, for instance, the laryngeal nerve was left in that particular form. He said there may well be a purpose for it, and I'll come back to that because sometimes we're ignorant of purpose. But I also came across another source of information which says the laryngeal nerve is actually connected to a number of other organs as well, and that is why it needs to be the length that it is. So just in a relatively short period of searching, I saw that the anti-God argument was not as clear as it was being made out. But this reminded me of the old argument about so-called vestigial organs. It used to be argued that the body has many organs which are no longer necessary, and this is proof of evolution, that we needed those organs at one time or another, but then we evolved beyond that point. So we've got organs like the tonsils and the appendix and so forth, which are not needed. And therefore that proves that we evolved, we weren't created. However, what was found as the years rolled by was that list of so-called vestigial organs shortened and shortened and shortened as it was found that the various organs did indeed have functions. And even in my lifetime, we've seen how rather than just cutting out the tonsils every time somebody got tonsillitis, doctors wanted to leave the tonsils there. Why? Because they had a purpose. So the fact may well be that we might not understand something at a given time, but that doesn't mean there's no explanation for it. There's no reason for it. So here in this case, here were some things that struck me, some academic questions, but what did I do? I went looking for answers rather than leaving them to build up and build up in my mind. And let me say this, I'd encourage you to look for answers yourself, because I find that if you go through the effort of doing some study yourself and finding the answers, that will stick with you far more than if you do go around asking people looking for quick solutions. Because sometimes you find that isn't as convincing as doing the work yourself. Now, you might say, yeah, but sometimes I don't know where to begin. I don't know where to search for the answers. Well, the simple answer to that is ask. That made me think of Acts the 8th chapter with Philip and the Ethiopian that was travelling along in his chariot. And I read here in Acts chapter 8 and verse 30, so Philip ran over to join the chariot. Let me start that again. So Philip ran to him and heard him reading Isaiah the prophet and asked, "Do you understand what you are reading?" And he said, "How can I unless somebody guides me?" And he invited Philip to come up and sit with him, and we then have the explanation that the Ethiopian is reading from Isaiah 53, and then we go down to verse 34, and the eunuch said to Philip, "About whom, I ask you, does the prophet say this? About himself or about somebody else?" See, he didn't know the answers, and he wasn't sure how to find out. But there was Philip, and so he turned to Philip and said, "Can you help me understand this?" And that's the way it is with us. If you've got intellectual questions that are bothering you and you're not sure how to go about it, then go to somebody in the church who's experienced, and don't seek just a quick, easy answer, but get some tips on how you might go about finding the answers. Don't let them build up and build up in your mind. A third point, seek assistance from appropriate sources. Now, not every problem can be dealt with in the way I've just mentioned. Not every problem is an intellectual problem because, as I've already mentioned, there are physical, mental, emotional and spiritual aspects to our being. And it may well be that a problem is caused by something in a different area. People can develop sometimes a long-term physical condition which drains them not only physically but mentally as well, and that in turn can drain you spiritually. So it's not that you have a spiritual problem, but really what needs treating is the physical problem that's affecting all of your being. So it can really help to identify the true cause of the problem. It may be that you're going through something like burnout. And that again, that doesn't have to be a reason to give up your faith. There's ways to treat that. So often in churches you hear simplistic solutions. Look, you just need to have more faith, or you need to pray more. But sometimes that's not a helpful response. I think of Paul's advice to Timothy over in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 23. "No longer drink only water, but use a little wine for the sake of your stomach and your frequent ailments." So apparently Timothy had a bit of a sort of weak constitution physically there. He was prone to health problems. And Paul says, don't just drink water, drink some wine as well. And I can imagine some Australians saying, there you go, we can drink whenever we feel like it. Well, you need to look a bit more at what wine exactly was in those days, and I can tell you it was nowhere near as strongly alcoholic as what some wines are today. But the point here is, back in those days, in that part of the world, and indeed in many parts of the world, you didn't have pure water, and sometimes there'd be bacteria or something else in the water, and if you were prone to getting health problems, then the water could easily affect you. It's still that way in some places now. And so Paul was saying the solution to that is drink something else. He didn't just say, Timothy, pray about it, or Timothy, have more faith and these problems will go away. He gave the particular solution to the true nature of Timothy's problem. So if you are struggling in some way, it pays to identify the relevant problem by getting the right sort of advice from the right sort of people. Now, you might have a spiritual problem. You might have doubts, questions, or whatever relating to the Bible. Well, then go to a preacher or somebody who's got a depth of Bible knowledge, an elder perhaps, and seek some guidance from them. You may have financial problems that are getting you down. Go to somebody with some experience in financial matters. It may be a psychological problem. It may be depression. It may be burnout. Well, then talk to your GP about somebody qualified to give you some help in that particular area. It may be an ongoing problem with sin. There's some sin you're trying to overcome in your life and you just find yourself not succeeding. Well, again, find those in the church who can understand and talk to you. James 5 and verse 16, therefore confess your sins to one another and pray for one another. It's a bit like Alcoholics Anonymous. Seek help from people who have an understanding and a grasp of what the problem is and how you can deal with it. I think of Rehoboam in the Old Testament. Rehoboam was the son of King Solomon. When Solomon died, Rehoboam was to inherit the throne. But the people came to Rehoboam and said, look, things were pretty tough under your father Solomon. If you will just ease off a bit, that would be much better, and we'll stand with you. And Rehoboam went off to the wise, experienced men, and they said, yeah, listen to the people. But then he went off to his young mates. And they said, what, you're going to back down? Let them know how tough you are. And so he went to the people and said, you think my father was tough? Wait till you've seen me. And the end result was he lost most of the kingdom because he listened to bad advice. Time and time again, I've seen weak, struggling Christians go to other weak, struggling Christians for advice. And in the Bible language, it becomes a case of the blind leading the blind. Get the appropriate advice from people who are qualified to help in that particular area, and having got the advice, apply it. Over the years, I've seen Christians, young and old, go from person to person to person, talking about the same issues, asking the same questions, which they never resolve. And in fact, some of them will take copious notes, but again, they don't do anything with it. They don't apply what they hear. And sometimes there'll be telltale phrases. You'll talk to somebody and they'll say, okay, I'll go and pray about it, which is code language for, I don't like that advice and I don't want to do anything with it. Well, sometimes dealing with a problem may take some effort. And if we don't like being told that, we're never going to deal with the problem. Go to somebody experienced, go to somebody who can help, get the advice from them and apply the advice. Even if it's hard, apply the advice. A fourth point that I make here is weigh up the cost. Now, we've often used that in terms of weigh up the cost of being a Christian. Are you ready to make the commitment that Christianity involves? And it does involve some effort, some commitment. For instance, you can go over to Luke, the 9th chapter, verse 57 here. And as they were going along the road, someone said to him, to Jesus, I will follow you wherever you go. And Jesus said to him, foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And Jesus' point here was to this man who said, I'll follow you. Jesus said, look, I can't offer you an easy life. I can't offer you a 4-star motel or hotel along the way. It's going to be tough. It's going to be demanding at times. Are you willing to face that? Or you can go a little bit further to Luke, the 14th chapter, and let me read here from verse 25. Now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and said to them, this is Jesus speaking, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. It's not talking about literally hating your family. Rather, it's saying your love and commitment to Christ must be all that much greater. Verse 27, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king, going out to encounter another king in war, will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. And Jesus says there, it won't be easy, and you have to ask yourself, am I prepared to make the commitment? Count the cost. But let me turn that around for Christians. Count the cost of giving up your faith, of no longer following Jesus. Come over to Hebrews chapter 10. The book of Hebrews, it appears, was written to Jewish Christians who were struggling and who were ready to give up. Look what's said here in Hebrews chapter 10, beginning in verse 32. But recall the former days when, after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore do not throw away your confidence, which has great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. For yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. What is being said to the readers here is that they had faced tough times and they had been committed. And so the message is, don't give up now. Don't throw away the hope that you have. And then it quotes from the Old Testament and makes the point that God will come. Jesus Christ will come. But verse 38, if my righteous one, if he shrinks back, my righteous one, my soul has no pleasure in him. That's the cost of turning away from God. You lose all the blessings, all the hope that you had as a Christian. Now, I'm aware that there are atheists who say, look, I'm an atheist, I'm totally happy. I know one Christian who is an extremely sincere, caring, dedicated person, but who is now an atheist and says they're happy with that. Well, denial of God does not make God disappear. God doesn't exist only if we believe in him and cease to exist if we don't believe in him. Either there is a God or there isn't a God, and the evidence says there is a God, and I'll come back to that. But let me illustrate all of this, again going back to a time 40 odd years ago when I was really struggling. And I was out walking and I was thinking about this because that's my way of dealing with things. And I sorted through a lot of stuff that was in my mind. And what I came down to was this basic, fundamental reality. I believed in God. I believed. And nothing had taken that away. So despite all the struggling that I was going through, there was still this fundamental foundation. And I knew that if I walked away from the church and I walked away from Christianity, I would always be looking over my shoulder with the knowledge there is a God, and one day I will face God. Now the reaction to that might be, see, you're governed by fear. No. I've had more than 45 years since then, 45 years of learning, 45 years of experience, 45 years of dealing with questions and struggles and searching for answers. And I firmly believe now, even more than in the past, that there is a God. I'm not governed by fear. What I'm governed by is the need to face up to reality. The evidence for me points to the fact that there is a God. That being the case, I cannot deny that. I cannot go into denial. I can't live my life that way. There is a God. And I might choose to ignore that now, but sooner or later I will be forced to face up to that. And I'm going to live my life with that reality in mind, rather than trying to live a life of denial. Giving up Christianity won't make God go away. In fact, giving up Christianity won't make a lot of other problems go away either. If you're struggling, with work or other things like that, the problems will still be there whether you're a Christian or not. And God will certainly still be there whether you're a Christian or not. Have I struggled with faith? Have I struggled to find answers? Have I struggled with problems? Yes, and I've just said so. Even now, there are some things I can't answer. There are problems I can't find the solution to. But I remember something that a preacher named Ed Wharton said many, many years ago. It goes something like this. He said, yes, there were things that he didn't know. And there were things that he couldn't explain. But he said, on the other hand, there were things that he definitely did know, and there were things that he could explain, and the things that he didn't know didn't change the things that he did know, and the things that he couldn't explain didn't change the things that he could explain. And I think that's an important understanding to have in your life. I try to find answers. I've spent my life trying to find answers at all sorts of levels to all sorts of issues, even trying to read up on things like quantum physics and so forth. And I have to admit, some of this stuff is way beyond my intellectual capacity, and some things I don't grasp. But there are things that I do grasp, and there are things regarding which I've studied the evidence, and there are things which I do know from the evidence, from everything that I've examined. And that leads me to the belief that there is a God. And that makes me think of a well-known atheist named Antony Flew, who was very much opposed to the idea of God. But in his own words, eventually the evidence led him to believe that yes, there is some higher being. And he made that declaration back in 2004. Even if there are some academic things that I don't have the answer for, nevertheless, I'm not going to let that defeat me because of all the other things that I do have the answers for. So if you're struggling with your faith, seek every opportunity to build up your faith. Search for the answers, because the answers by and large can be found. Seek help from appropriate people and weigh up the cost of giving up. Is that going to make things better, or is it in fact going to make things worse? There are answers. There is help. Don't give up. Don't let yourself be defeated. It isn't worth it. If you need some help, some guidance, then just ask. Let's pray. Father, again, we think of Jesus' promise. Seek and you will find. Ask and it will be given to you. Knock and the door will be opened. The answers are there to be found. And even though some things lie only within your knowledge, there are many, many things to which you have given us the answers. Help us, Lord, to realize the value of being a Christian, to realize that nothing is worth the loss of our own soul. Help us, Lord, to be serious and to really work to stay on the path of faith. And if we are struggling, help us to find answers and to find help. And you have promised that the help and the answers are there. And you have promised that your desire is for our salvation, and you don't want to see us fall away. You rather want us to walk with you. Please help us to do so. Thank you for your love, and thank you for your word, and thank you for all those you've given us who can be a help to us. And thank you above all for Christ and your grace and your mercy. And it's through Christ we pray. Amen. So, another week. We're back at the church hall now at Bankstown. We were back there last Sunday, and we plan for that to continue. Of course, there are some restrictions that are still applying, but they're easing. Things do seem to be getting better, and we can be grateful for that. And having been given a way through all of this, let's make the best use of it we can, and not waste our time, not waste our lives, but try to use every day to the best that we possibly can. Take care of yourself in the meantime, and hopefully we'll get together again next week. Bye-bye.